Hey there guys, and welcome back, and we are here. We have finally completed the combat demo. So, as usual, we'll go through the changes first, and then since we have the demo done, I will run through the demo a couple times just so we can talk about it. So, in the first hour here, that is when the demo basically got done. I was really tempted at lunchtime to actually keep on going and try it out, but I knew it was going to take a while because I knew it wasn't going to be perfect the first time. So I put it off till after lunch and then finished it up, and it did in fact take me the full hour to actually do everything I wanted to get it looking decent. Well, I say to get it looking decent. Fact of the matter is that it was about 45 minutes fixing bugs, errors, programmer errors, my fault. About 45 minutes doing that, and then maybe 15 minutes sprucing it up and making it look nice in the second hour. So that is where we're at. As usual, I will go ahead and take the GitHub changes off the screen for myself and let you just look at the code and run through it as we go. So the easiest one to start off with from memory is just a quick change in equipment.js, and let me get VS Code up on my screen because I can't actually see it. There it is. Alright, so equipment.json, we just changed this to a warm-up. This is the charge rifle, or actually it's a kinetic rifle, but I wanted to give it a warm-up time to make sure that warm-up times actually worked in combat. Previously, this was a 2-second cooldown and no warm-up, so I changed that to 1 second cooldown and 1 second warm-up. And when we get to combat, you'll see how this all interplays in between, you know, the 1 damage from the weapon and the 2 damage from the rifle. One of those things, it's a nice, it works out nicely for a demo purposes. A very minor change, it looks like, on LiteLike. I just changed this from start game to start demo because all we're doing is a demo right here. And I also added in the style block. I was going to use it and then changed my mind. So that is just a very, very minor change. And then we get to all the big changes. So the first big change actually comes in... Oh, it's funny. I actually... Okay, I got rid of some. I take it back. So in io.js, we had, I had left those console.logs in here. I believe I got rid of those while we were doing the code review last time. So that's the last of the minor ones, and now we're on to the big changes. So, first big change is now. You will recall that I had stored up here in a variable the now that worked here. So between performance.now and a whole bunch of different stuff. Let me actually pull up the changes so that I can read them off. So performance.now, moz now, ms now, o now, webkit now, or date.now. That was a full list right here, and I stored those in a variable, and then to figure out which one actually worked, and then used it down here. Evidently, when you do that, I guess in the module, within the module, it basically loses track of what's going on or something like that. I don't completely understand it because, again, do not do a huge amount of programming in JavaScript, although it is in my top 2. But basically, I got illegal. Illegal invocation. Illegal invocation. When I had that up here, if I moved that down into this block, then it worked, if I recall correctly. But it didn't work if I did it in certain ways. So I actually spent maybe 10 minutes playing around with it, changing different ways to write it in an attempt to make it look nicer. And one of the things, just plain look nicer. Unfortunately, they did not work, so I just gave up and threw a hissy fit and just did performance.now at this point. One of those things may not work in your browser, but I'll cry about it later. So that is the first major change, the fact that the now function, which is pretty important to the program, got changed and may not be functioning correctly on all platforms at this point until I really sort everything out and fix it. The next big change would all be in game. Oh, okay. Equipment. Equipment, we have some relatively minor changes. So up here in weapon ranges, I was a derp face, and instead of passing melee and range as individual arguments to enumerate, I passed them as an array, and that broke it. So that was good. And then I also added the exports in here because one of those things, just going through the process of adding exports as I need them. Additionally, down here on is available, previously we only checked cooldown was ready. Now we are also checking that its cooldown is ready and warm-up is ready for available. So that is a relatively important change. I added in this is charging function right here. It's one of those deals. It's just I kept on coming up to these situations where it was useful to find out whether or not the weapon was charging. You know, not only is it available, is fireable, but is it actually charging? So just wrote that in here, added that function, easy peasy. And then let's see. 87, we're line 87. Okay, and fire. Oh, okay. So evidently originally I just had this as now instead of utils.now. That was a typo. And what we got next, 122. 122 is not a line. Let's see, where are we at? Oh, okay, gotcha. So down here I have... Where is it at then in that case? There you go. So, is charging. I made this change here once we added in the is charging. So that was another relatively simple. And then I missed another max down here. So this was just max of these two. And again, it's got to be math.max in JavaScript. So that was another relatively simple change. And that covers us for the equipment. And yep, so our only two left are combat and game, which are the two main focuses of today's coding sessions. So I guess we start with combat. I mean, it's one of those things. I'm probably going to bounce back and forth between both of them. But combat. Okay. Let me just check something really quick. Oh, okay. Remember when I said that melee and ranged over here on equipment? I put in arrays. I misremembered. So this was correct. It was combat. In combat, the states, the ranges, or action types rather. It was not the ranges. It was the action types. So action types was in an array instead of in instead of separate arguments. I added the end combat. That way we can tell, or we can notify things that the combat is officially finished. That is useful. Down here in events, I was a derp face, and arrays get push in JavaScript. They do not get append. So that was one of those things. Mixed up my Spanish and my French. Next one. Okay, this is kind of important. Object.assign is what you need to do here. I just did the event.assign. Or actually, no, to begin with, I just passed this function to this object rather to the event function, the event constructor rather, and it did not throw an error, which is one of those kind of annoying JavaScript things for having arguments in there that were not valid, which would have tipped me off earlier, but it's one of those things. It takes, if I remember from, let's see, it's bubble, or does bubble, or something like that. Bubbles, yeah, I can't remember all the flags that are inside of the object that you can pass into event, but the fact that we're hijacking event basically caused me problems. So we're hijacking event here, and then to assign things, you got to use object.assign. I was just using event.assign, which was incorrect. So that was a relatively easy fix, and again, just bad on my part. Down here we had result equals, forgot to include the let. That's a minor thing. Down here, new character action, again forgetting my news. Nothing new there. I'm hilarious. At the end of combat loop, we got to bind this to combat loop, otherwise it forgets who it is on the next time out. That was a rather important mistake that I actually should have known about. I should have seen that one. That was 100% a failure on my part. Inside of the handle weapon function is the next place we're at. A lot of this got rearranged. So I'm not going to go over absolutely everything, but just understand the way I was doing it, I decided to rearrange it, and it is now in the shape it is, and obviously everything is documented. So you can feel free to read through the documentations once it's up on the GitHub. So one of those deals there. So. Let's see here. The other important thing, however, is back to we have the trigger event now. Now that we're adding the trigger event, use weapon, which again I had not implemented quite yet in the previous session, so that got implemented in this one. We did want to record the damage that we were dealing and pass that on to the listeners before we dealt the damage. As I note here, we probably should do a before and after damage is dealt, or before and after weapon is used. So start of handle weapon, end of handle weapon, something like that. We probably should have multiple events for this, but we do not because we're trying to keep things simple. So that is simply how it is right now. And then likewise down here, we added in the trigger event for the use item. Use item is a little bit more tricky because there is literally just callback and use. So unlike handle weapon, where not only is there all this stuff with charging and whatnot up here and dealing damage, so it's multifaceted and we have different entry and exit points for it. Beyond that, we also basically we have no way to interact anywhere in between this callback is what I'm trying to get at. So up here we can at any point in here put in extra events if we need to manipulate what's going on here. And furthermore, weapons in theory I've been talking about should probably have a precision, or otherwise characters should have an evasion rate, because that did come up in a dark room. So this is all questionable still. This is all something that could or could not happen. Right now with handle item, it's like guaranteed. There is no mischance. There is no this won't work right now. And therefore, it's just kind of like, okay, we're going to tell you, what I'm getting at here is that this trigger event, like, it doesn't matter if we move it up here because we can't change anything necessarily aside from just cancel it altogether. We can't modify the callback at all at this point in time, which is a little bit of an issue, but it's only an issue if we let it be, frankly. And then I threw in this resolve combat. We had resolve combat up here in the combat loop at the bottom of the combat loop, or top of the combat loop. One of the two. It was in the combat loop. Let me find it really quick. There we go. Resolve combat. So we had resolve combat in the combat loop, but we never actually wrote the function. So very simply, just trigger the end of combat event, which we talked about earlier. And that takes care of it. So that is all the changes to combat. And the only things that were not really errors and were actually things that I needed to fix in order to get it running was the stuff in handle weapon. I believe, in here, this additional check right here, end weapon.warm up equals weapon states.ready. I didn't have this before, which means that we were actually constantly rewarming up the weapon. So on each loop, the weapon restarted charging for the kinetic rifle, which was a problem. So that was the one actual error that we had to fix, like the one actual game-breaking error and not simply a programming error that I had to fix. The one thing that actually screwed up the demo in the combat loop, or in the combat file, rather, as far as I remember, at any rate. And it was just this afternoon, so if I don't remember, that's a bit of a problem. Next up, and this is, again, the biggest changes, because this is where the demo is actually taking place. So, let us see. I'm just going to look back over everything really quick. So, first off, the biggest change that I made, or I guess the most noticeable change, I guess I should say, is that I actually gave these tables IDs and I started giving other things in here ways to track them back down afterwards. So all these, character.id, etc., etc., etc. I added all this stuff in because originally I was just going to print out the base stats of the characters and then just verbally in lines say what was happening during combat, log what was happening during combat. I decided to actually update their stats in real time. So now during each of the loops, if we come down here, at end of stack, I update weapons, items, and HP. So if the weapon is now on cooldown, then it gets changed to cooldown. If an item has its quantity changed, i.e. the repair bot on the player character, that gets changed. If the HP of the character is changed because he's been shot or axed, that gets changed. So now we are updating these stat blocks at the top of the page, which, one of those things. Originally, I was going to be lazy and not do any of that because, look, it's just a demo, whatever. But I figured it was worth the effort. I figured it was worth the presentation to add that in. So that was probably the most important change on the, as far as you're going to see in terms of the demo, is just making it so that these stat blocks are now editable as we run through the combat. Otherwise, let's see what else we got. Okay, nope, not that. That's not really important. Okay, similarly, just in that vein, the weapons and items, when we put them on the screen, you'll see that they have index now. So we are using I instead of for weapon in char.weapons, and then down here on items, instead of for item in char.items, we're using I as an index and then accessing it from there. That way we can add data index to the item, which means that we can look it up later on. So back to updating the character, that's how we're doing it. We're tagging each of these table rows and looking it up from there. So that's the deal there. Also, I added state to the end of these table rows, to the ends of the items and weapons. That way we can display cooldown, charging, etc. after the weapon or item. And let's see, what is next? Evidently, I didn't have the fight log declared yet, so we have a fight log. So this is just an extra box, an extra div, where the... Well, actually, no, that's right. I changed it from a div to an unordered list just because that was quicker to format. So now our fight log is just a bunch of bulleted items in a list of things that have happened during combat, which is useful. Output to... Where's that at? Output to fight log. So this is just a useful function. So we just pass it in a string, and it adds it to the fight log as a line item. Oh, up here, new character action. Again, forgot my news. It's all news to me. And then we get to all the brand new stuff. So we have our use weapons function. Well, callback rather. This is the listener callback, right? So from the event, we get the event.action. So the event returns the action, right, that's being taken. That's what gets tacked onto the event. We talked about that last time. So from there, we can get the activator and the object. So the character name and the weapon. We can check if it is dealing damage. At the moment, the only way it's not dealing damage is if it's charging. So if we get a callback that is not dealing damage, we know automatically that it's charging. So we can just say character is charging his weapon. Okay, where weapon is, it's weapon name, i.e. kinetic rifle. Otherwise, we just have this generic string right here that we're outputting, again, to the output to fight log to save ourselves a bit of typing. And prior to that, obviously, we get the opponent's name because we're about to kill him. So we have character, attacks, etc. with weapon, and deals damage. Very simple, very straightforward output. And then similarly, use item, character uses item. Very, very simple. And then this is the update on the weapons, items, and HP that I was telling you about before. So this is at the end of stack, or the end stack rather event. Just end stack is what it's called. And at the end stack event, that is the point. If we come over here to combat, that combat stack. This is combat stack, right? Yeah. So at that point, we've already updated weapons for both characters. So it's one of these deals. Everything on the characters should be updated, so we can just look at the characters and update from there. So they've already been dealt damage, and they've already had their weapons updated. So we should be good just to output to the screen what is going on. So if we run through this really quick, because it's rather straightforward, we get the table for the character. So we get the character's ID and then get the element by ID to get the table that belongs to the character. So player 0 would be the player character. Player 1 would be the brigand, the space brigand. We update the HP. Again, that's a very simple, straightforward thing. Just table query. So this is an ID right here, right? So the ID is player 0 HP. In theory, we could just do document, but I prefer to use table.querySelector because that's more descriptive. At least for us, you know. And then we run through the weapons. So we just run through each of the weapons in the player's inventory, and then we try to get it out of the table. Now, I should, in theory, have a catch here, just in case for some reason a character drops his weapon. That's never going to happen in this demo, which is why I didn't put it in here. But in theory, in the real game, if we were going to copy and paste this code into the actual gameplay itself, into the actual combat screen, we'd want to have a code in here to check if this state element actually exists, and if it doesn't, that means that the weapon is no longer, or I guess what I should say is, yeah, alright, so that's how we'd have to do it, actually. We'd have to actually check the weapon type. Alright, that's actually, okay, I did not consider this before. There we go. Yeah, I did not actually consider what we would need to do up until this point. But the fact of the matter is that if we lost a weapon in combat, then actually, at that point, actually, its index would be off, which means that this method of doing it would be wrong. Now, in reality, this is not actually a problem for us, because you'll recall when I was talking about the game, I was saying that in our version of the game, because I didn't like the fact that the buttons moved around as you lost weapons, and therefore your weapon may be in a new place the next time you play combat because you lost the weapon. I didn't like that feature, therefore I was going to change it so that your loadout was always ordered in the same exact way each and every time. So the player's weapons would actually be, the player's weapons that he brings into combat would actually be an array of 5, a 5-length array. And then you would actually have holes in it if you didn't have weapons in those slots. So if you had a weapon in 1, 3, and 5, right, then 2 and 4, or I guess it would be, 0, 2, and 4. If you have weapons in 0, 2, and 4, then 1 and 3 would be none. Or null, rather. It's JavaScript, so null. They would just be null, and therefore we could manage it like that. So it wouldn't matter as much for actual combat because, again, the placement of the weapons in the arsenal actually matters, and therefore if a weapon disappears out of the arsenal, that'd be immediately obvious. But for the way we have this demo set up right now, where everything is just pushed directly into the weapons array, that is a bit of a difference. That does make a bit of a difference. But that's only if we lost weapons during combat, which we're not doing right now, so it's an entire moot point. There we go. So as you can see, we assume that any weapon is ready at the top here. Just, it's one of those things. You got to initialize state anyway, so may as well initialize it as ready. And then we check, is it on cooldown? Okay, if it is, we do. Otherwise, if it's charging, all right, it's charging. Otherwise, we check, obviously. I say obviously, but you can read it, is all I'm trying to say. So, if the warmat is not ready, then the state is whatever weapon.warmat is. If it's charging, then this is already covered, right? So if it's charging, then that means that weapon.warmup is not either fired or charged. Those are the only two situations that we have not covered already between ready, or I guess, yeah, okay, so we haven't covered ready. So if this is not ready. There you go. That's where we covered it. I knew we covered it somewhere. So here we're checking if it's not ready. So our only other two options are charged and fired, because this says it's not ready and this says it's not charging, which is a float. There we go. Got that warmed up, cleared up. So then we just set it to either fired or charged. Now, neither of those two, in theory, will ever make it onto the screen, because this happens at the end of the combat loop, at which point the weapon's already been cycled from charged to fired, and then from fired to ready at the end of the combat loop, or at the end of the combat stack, I should say, rather. So those never actually make it onto the screen, but it's there just in case. And otherwise, statele.textContext, or statele rather, .textContent equals state. There we go. Too many X's. And then items just do the same exact thing. You know, we get the row for the item, we update its quantity, make sure that's, you know, up to date, and update its state. Now, this does bring up the fact that I keep on pushing off implementing cooldown for items. Repair bots at the moment, if we come over here to equipment.json, there it is. As you can see, cooldown is 1000, but equipment.js, we don't actually have any infrastructure for that. We only have this .cooldown is null, but we don't have, you know, any code that actually puts it onto cooldown or checks the cooldown, you know. So, for example, in the update state down here for weapons, we have this .cooldown is not ready, and therefore check it and update it if necessary. So that is something I've been putting off. So that is not in the game demo, but we have literally exactly one repair bot for the game demo, which means that the repair bot is never on cooldown because we have no cooldowns left, or we have no repair bots left. So that's my justification there. I did not put the time into putting cooldown into the game yet for items because I was literally working, as you can see right here. I mean, we saw it at the beginning. Where's the readme? You know, I was already 4 minutes past my deadline by the time I got the demo. By the time I ran through the demo a few times, just double checking that everything was right. So I did not have time to put it in. It will get in eventually. Back over to game. So obviously this is all there. We added these two, right? The end stack and end combat. End combat is just very simply we update the weapons, items, and HP one last time because we exit at the beginning of the combat loop, and the combat stack will exit early if a player has been knocked out. That's part of the functionality in the combat stat, so that we don't take extra actions. We have this if this dot handle KO, so if a character is KO'd, we return immediately back to the combat loop, which means that we never actually re-update the stats, which means that we've got to do it before we end combat here. Then we get the victor's name and say Victor is victorious. Very simple. The last thing I did, the very last thing I did at the very end, right before I ran the loop a last couple of times to make sure that it was working, I disabled the start demo button at the top here. And we'll scroll up to there. There we go. So at the very beginning of run demo, I disabled the start demo button. And then at the end here, obviously, when combat is over, then we can undisable it. We can re-enable it. And since we're able to do that back and forth and we're able to hit the demo button multiple times, I make sure to, there it is, make sure to clear out the fight box in between each and every match. So there we have it. We have completed a functional demo of the combat system, and now we get to look at it. So there we go. There is my web page, again running off of live server over here on VS Code. Down at the bottom right hand side you can see port 5500. So let us go ahead and hit the start demo. And I don't know if you could hear that. I probably should have muted myself while it was happening. I figured I'd take a drink while the combat was running for the first time. So that was your first time through it. So you got to see it once, and now I will talk over it. So the first thing to notice is, obviously, we got on cooldown here, and then you see it flicking back and forth between on cooldown and ready for the charging as we watch this. on cooldown charging, we never really see it say ready, and that's just a matter of how the AI and the combat stack is working. So not that big of a deal that it's not going on. Otherwise, the next thing we'll notice is HP going down. Looks correct, right? And you see that at some point the repair bot goes to 0. So it looks like everything is happening in this box correctly. Then we can just double check our math over here, right? And I did not put a step feature into this demo so that we could step through it slowly. I just let it run in real time. One of those things that would have taken a little bit extra time, and I was trying to get this done, so it didn't happen. So if we look at this, we attack with our battle axe. So at the start of combat, everything is off cooldown, which means that the player and the brigand can attack at the same exact time. Or I should say they could start an attack action. They could use weapon at the same exact time, because obviously Space Brigand starts charging his kinetic rifle. So we deal a damage with our battle axe. 1 second later, if we watch this log again as we're going, our battle axe will be off a cooldown and we'll be able to attack with it again. But that 1 second later is enough time, because the kinetic rifle has a 1 second charge up period for the kinetic rifle to attack. So the kinetic rifle then attacks, dealing 2 damage, and goes onto a 1 second cooldown. So 1 second later, our cooldown and his cooldown come off. So we are both ready to start our weapons. Ours deals damage, his starts charging, we deal damage again. At this point, the brigand has taken 4 damage. He only has 1 life left. He deals 2 damage to us, so now we only have 1 life left. And our AI, rather than going for this last attack to try to kill the brigand before he kills us, which technically in this demo will work, the AI has us activate the repair bot. Now that's just fine for us, because the fact of the matter is that, you know, we're going to get enough HP to survive the battle, so there's no real tactical advantage to not killing the brigand off immediately. But after we use the repair bot, then we go ahead and attack the brigand. His rifle's still on cooldown at this point. Our battle axe is ready, so we attack and we deal our 5th damage, killing the brigand, and player character is victorious. And there we go. So there is a fully functional combat demo, and you can see how there's about a second between each of these things, because everything is on 1 second cooldown right now. If everything was not on 1 second cooldown, then you might see some staggering of when the combat log comes through, but right now it's all on 1 second cooldown. And if we go back to the VS Code, I will remind us that our game is running at, I want to say, I actually forget, so it's a good thing I'm coming back over here to check. We have a frame rate set up, a quote-unquote frame rate, loop rate. Alright, so we're at 16 FPS. So we're getting 16 frames, or 16 combat loops per second is how we're running this. One of those things, the fact of the matter is that I don't know how many, so I guess a player, I did talk about this before. I did talk before when we were first setting up the player loop right here, or the player queue rather. I was talking about how many player actions actually could get put into this queue in the amount of time that a loop could happen. I guess there's a possibility that a player might be able to put more than one action, you know, click multiple items within 1/16 or 1/16 of a second. I guess there's a possibility. I'm not sure how feasible that is. So we have this player queue just in case, but it's possible that this player queue will never have more than one player action in it. Meanwhile, the AI on every single loop determines what it's going to do, which is attack rate, which means that the AI could rapid fire out a whole bunch of attacks if it has a whole bunch of attacks available. That may be something we might want to change. We might want to slow the AI down and only allow it to attack every once in a while. The only thing I will say is that in a dark room, I believe enemies only had one attack to begin with, which means that one weapon, I should say. They only had one weapon to begin with, which means that that weapon is going to go on to cooldown one way or another. So they don't have the opportunity to put more than one attack on the weapons, on the combat stack on each loop, because of that one weapon going immediately on the cooldown. So it may not be a problem, but it's something we may have to look at. Otherwise, at this point, now that we have a functional combat, again, gonna have to obviously provide for player input eventually. Take this screen that we have and turn this into an actual combat screen similar to a dark room, visually similar to a dark room. So a few different things to do with combat yet. But in the meantime, until we get to that point, we will be moving on to map next. Map is what I said we will be working on next. And that obviously is, well, it's going to be several things. First off, we're going to have to generate a pseudo-random map. I say pseudo-random because, as I understand it, a dark room, there are certain things that are generally in certain places. So we're going to have to do that. We're also going to have to... So I don't know at what point I start programming in random encounters. I'll have to make that decision. But at the very least, we got to populate the map, handle player input to move around the map, handle player location on the map, and handle... I guess at that point, once we have all that stuff in, then we are actually onto events too, because events could encompass not only random events in town, but the events that you come across while you're exploring quote-unquote cities, wreckages, star bases, whatever they end up being in our game, but they were cities and houses and mining sites in a dark room. So those were the different areas that you could... Oh, mines, also. Mines dungeons. So those little events that could be in there. Random events could be defined in events. But I already said random encounters. I said random events. What else? I think that's everything. I think it's basically locations you run into on the map could be events. Random encounters on the map could be events. And then random events in town while you're managing your base all fall into events. So we'll probably start working on events once we had the groundwork for maps. Not maps completely developed, but the groundwork for maps developed. And then once we start working on events, we probably also want to start working on the base management function feature, which is not even a file yet in scripts here. So one of the things we'll have to add that too. So that is where we are going with the game next. So I hope you have found this informative and have enjoyed the process to getting to a combat demo. I am very, very happy to hit a major milestone at this point in the game development. And we are only 10 hours in, right? Yeah, only 10 hours in. So that's pretty good. So, as always, I hope you have I was trying to figure out if there's anything else I wanted to say. No, I guess not. No, that's it. Alright, I take it back. Sorry. My bad. Alright, yeah. So if you have been listening, thank you. And I hope you have a great, wonderful day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're in the world. And I will catch you next time.